friends, and welcome back to the Socially Delightful Podcast. I'm Jewel, and we're going to be talking about resolutions today. So you know here that we are always talking about social perfectionism, confidence, connection, and being the most authentic version of yourself. And that also belongs with your resolutions. So a lot of times we're making resolutions from shame, from internalized capitalistic cultures, and no wonder why we are not sticking with them. So today we're going to be talking about how to create resolutions that actually light you up, make you feel good, are not coming from a place of like fixing yourself, but are coming from a place of enoughness, and that you will actually hit because they are more aligned with how brains actually work. Yeah, we're going to be talking about the brain today in resolutions. So let's get into it. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is perfectionism and perfectionistic fantasies. I see you. Do not skip this part to go to the part where I talk about the brain and how to make resolutions that you will actually stick to. Because if you are not aware of just this part, you might and probably will keep falling into these perfectionistic, shame-filled actions and behaviors unless you are aware of them. And I mean deeply aware of them, because this stuff is everywhere floating around in our culture. So it's something that we really got to filter out. So in order to really make a change, let's talk about perfectionistic fantasies to begin with. Now, perfectionistic fantasies, this idea comes from Kara Loewentheil, a Harvard feminist and coach. And it really showcases what happens when we are in the all or nothing kind of mindset. Perfectionistic fantasies really have to do with being in the all portion of the all or nothing mindset. There really are ideal versions of ourselves where we imagine that we wake up at 5 a.m. every day. We work out 5 times a week for at least an hour, but oh, don't worry. We also are so productive and focused every minute of the day. Our meals are Instagram worthy, organic, perfectly balanced. Our home is spotless. And we journal every night with perfect calligraphy and reflect on our days like a daily philosopher.
I don't know who that is, and I don't care to find out.
So here's the thing. We can tell as we're sitting here having this conversation right now that this is not rooted in reality. But in those moments, we are really believing that is real, that is something that we can achieve. But it's that kind of vision is not built to withstand the ups and downs of actual life. The thing that makes this so hard and something that we really, really need to be aware of is because, again, this is pushed at us through our culture, pushed at us through capitalistic self-help. This is so embedded in our culture that at like 12 years old, I was going to the Barnes and Noble trying to fulfill my perfectionistic fantasy, and I became a self-help addict at the age of 12, and honestly went through like the 12-step program basically for self-help addiction, because I was trying to fix myself because I had so much shame, and I thought if I could just be perfect, then I could just feel good about myself and I could finally just be worthy of love and success. So you really got to understand perfectionistic fantasies, because when we are making resolutions, that is the time that they're really going to come out, and they're going to feel so good. Because if you imagine that perfect vision, and maybe yours is a bit different, right? Maybe you're not waking up at 5 a.m. I don't know. Maybe you're waking up at 6 a.m. Whatever it may be. When we're imagining this perfect vision of how we are going to do everything right and be completely unbothered and just be so perfect, and then our lives will finally be perfect, that feels really good. And so we can make really rigid, tough resolutions that are actually coming from that. We will be perfect, finally, because I have shame about who I am right now as an imperfect being. It can be really easy to do that when you're making a resolution. Perfectionistic fantasies, these all or nothing mindsets, I think we could really see how these work when it comes to the restricting and binge eating cycle that a lot of people go through. Now, obviously, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but what I do know is that when people are restricting, it's often them trying to be perfect, them trying to eat perfectly. And so they're restricting, they're being so rigid, and it's so intense, and it's so pressure-filled, And then when something isn't perfect, they don't eat absolutely perfectly, then they're like, screw it. And then they go and binge eat, right? So we could see this all or nothing cycle. I think it's really important to understand the roots of this. One of the roots are individualism, right? In many cultures, like especially here in the West, we glorify individualism and self-reliance. We're taught that our successes and our failures are entirely within our control, and this creates a intense pressure to get everything right. This leads to this myth of complete and utter self-mastery, this idea that if we are disciplined, productive, and focused enough, we can achieve perfection in every area of our lives. In our careers, relationships, home, and even our emotions. Perfectionistic fantasies arrive because we think that achieving them will prove that we've made it and are deserving of success and love. Finally, this also, of course, comes from capitalism and productivity culture, right? Capitalism reinforces the idea that our value is tied to our output. I mean, this kind of culture, right, it sees rest as laziness. And when your worth feels tied to your productivity, it's really easy to fall into the perfectionistic fantasies of achieving more, doing better, and optimizing every area of your life. And then of course, social media and comparison trap. Social media has got us all thinking that everything needs to be aesthetic, even like our toothpaste. And then of course, this is particularly insidious for women because of patriarchy and gender roles, right? Be ambitious, but not too assertive. Be beautiful, but don't try too hard. Be a good mom, a good partner, a good friend, a good professional, and do it all effortlessly. These expectations make women feel like they have to be perfect and excel in every single one of these roles in order to be worthy. Perfectionistic fantasies often really emerge for women as a way of achieving all of these conflicting demands at once. Again, the fantasy of perfection. And of course, we cannot forget white supremacy and the demand for perfection that is tied to that. White supremacy culture, as outlined by scholars like Tema Ukan, I can never know if I say that right, but she outlines that white supremacy culture places a high value on perfectionism because it teaches us that mistakes unacceptable and that people must constantly be proving their worth through flawless performance. This creates internalized pressure, especially for marginalized groups, because they feel, as reports show, that they need to work harder, be better to overcome biases and discrimination. So for marginalized groups, perfectionistic fantasies could come out as a coping mechanism. And then of course we have purity culture and moral perfectionism. We have fear of rejection and shame. Y'all, at the heart of perfectionistic fantasies is a deep fear of rejection. Many people believe that if they aren't perfect, they'll lose connection, they'll lose approval, and they will lose respect from others. So hopefully that helps you understand the insidious roots of this, but also a bit of how that shows up in maybe your everyday life. Because if we don't release some of the perfectionistic fantasies, some of the shame and fear of rejection, it's going to be really hard to make a goal that actually comes from a place of enoughness and propels us forward and aligns with how the brain actually works. So to really showcase this, I wanted to share a story with you. So I have a client and I got permission to share this story, of course. And this client had a lovely dinner with her partner the night before where they talked and they just spent hours like chatting together, and they got really into the dinner that they made, like, right? Like they made it so like artful and, really went all out. And then they decided, to put the dishes in the sink and go to bed early. Well, that's a really great night. That's a lovely night. That's a night that, in my opinion, is about living and enjoying the people around you and enjoying your experiences. And then the next morning, my client got up, got ready for work, went down to the kitchen and saw the dishes in the sink and went, oh, shoot, we have to come up with a system to fix this. This shouldn't be happening. Oh my gosh, now I have all of these dishes to do. Y'all, she had a fantastic night with her partner, and yet one of the first thoughts that came up was about how can I make this more perfect and avoid imperfection. So this is sneaky, this is insidious. And again, when we are trying to create goals, if we're coming at it from this place of treating ourselves like we are a robot and we just gotta type in the perfect coding and then feel a lot of shame when we aren't robots, it's just hard, it's difficult. So here is a new way to think about goals that will actually help you. I think it's really helpful to think about your goals not as something that you either don't do or you do, not as like a checkbox or not, but as a spectrum. So for example, let's say you have a goal of working out 3 times a week. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got like your worst case scenario. And I'm talking like busiest week of your life. You have so many deadlines, or you got cramps, or you're going through a breakup and you're feeling a lot of emotions. In your worst case scenario, you're probably not going to be perfectly working out, right? So what are you going to do in your worst case scenario? Is it like, okay, I'm going to rest? Is it like I'm going to stretch? Or I'm going to take 10 minutes and do a gentle yoga YouTube video in my pajamas because that's all that you can manage? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you got your goal scenario. And maybe that is an hour-long strength training session at the gym where, you feel strong and energized and you're like, yeah.
I've been working out. Excuse me a second. Yeah.
Both ends of the spectrum count. Why? Because one, you are building that habit of being aware and moving your body and making sure you move your body those 3 times a week, right? That is going to create progress no matter what. Because if you look at your worst case scenario as enough, you're not going to fall into the shame cycle and, oh my gosh, I'm just not good enough, I just can't do it, I failed again, where you feel shame and then you either avoid working out because you feel so bad that you just end up, watching The Office for the 5th time, or you look at that as enough and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm glad that I showed up for myself, like I'm doing this, I can keep going. That's motivating. A lot of people are like, how do I stay motivated? That will solve a lot of the quote-unquote motivation problems. So looking at that worst case scenario as enough, because especially as you are working on this goal, this resolution, there's going to be times in the middle, right? Where maybe you have a really busy day and then you forget that working out 3 times a week is one of your goals. And then you're like, oh my gosh, shoot. When you're allowing for flexibility and you're allowing for life, you're like, okay, you know what? I forgot. Maybe I don't have time to go to the gym, but I have 30 minutes right now. Let me, lift like some objects that I have in my house and do some squats and move my body that way. This also helps, especially if you are going from working out 0 times a week to 3 times a week. This also helps build momentum to make this your new normal. This is going to sound ridiculous, but I did this with like fruits and veggies where I realized that there were some days this is embarrassing, but like, hey, adulting. There were some days where I realized, oh my gosh, I had like no vegetables today. And this was something that I did. And it was embarrassing. And at one point I was like, oh my gosh, this isn't enough of making sure I have like 1 serving a day. I need to be making sure that I have at least 2 of like full servings. Like I'm making sure I have a salad every day. But I know that's not how the brain works, right? So starting small, then you could add more stuff into it, like this noodle did. So step 1, spectrum and flexibility for your goals. 2, this also really works because it works with the 6 stages of change. So the 6 stages of change, They are pre-contemplation, contemplation, determination, action, maintenance, and then relapse or reoccurrence. So having flexibility also works with, honestly, just how the process of change works. Because perfectionistic fantasies thinks that there is a graph and that we just move linearly up that graph and are constantly improving. But that's not actually how it works. We're actually really messy because we're human beings, and we have this cycle where we spiral upwards, where it's like beep, 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 upwards. Okay? And we can see that through the stages of change. So I'm not going to go through all of the stages of change completely, but one thing that's important to notice is that the last step is relapse or reoccurrence. And that is where you slide or slip back into old habits. You might be like, what the heck? Well, that's upsetting, right? When I was really trying to break my perfectionistic tendencies with how I worked as an entrepreneur, there were so many moments where I sat down and I was like, I'm going to be super productive and do this just right. And then I would get distracted, get focused. I really had to cycle upwards. And there were so many times where I slipped back into old habits like task jumping or pulling out my phone and scrolling, right? It took me a while, and I'm still working on this process because there's no such thing as checking it off completely when it comes to a goal like this or a resolution like this. But I have cycled upwards so much where now I am so much more quote unquote productive. But part of that was through not shaming myself and be like, dang it, I ruined it again. I task jumped. Part of the reason why this is so important to recognize when you are creating these resolutions is understanding that you will slip back into old habits and behaviors. And here's part of the reason why. Because our brain is operating from two systems, okay? Arguably so. From a conscious part of us that makes goals and that makes conscious decisions about how we show up, and a more primitive part of us that is just reacting to things, that just wants to, sit on the couch and eat cookies, right? And that part of us, the more primitive part of us, tends to be the more relaxed and habitual part of us. It tends to be operating from things that we're really familiar from. So anyway, when we are creating goals, a lot of times we're creating our goals and outlining them from the really conscious part of us, from the goal-oriented part of us. And then as time goes on and we start to get familiar with the goal, our primitive part starts to come up. And that primitive part has old habits and old wirings, and so we're going to slip back into it. Hopefully I'm explaining this good enough. But here I am explaining it anyway, because it doesn't have to be perfect. Right? So for example, let's just even take a resolution like being less angry. Not that I think that's like a great one, but let's just take that. Like, I want to be less reactive. So you want to practice pausing before reacting to a situation. There's going to be times where you're really aware and you're in that really conscious part of you and you're like, stop, pause, let me take my 3 seconds, let me take a breath, and now let me respond. And there's going to be times where it goes on and then you're like, shoot, and you just react, right? And so the point of me sharing this with y'all is for y'all to expect this, not get defeated by this, and understand that a relapse or a reoccurrence is part of the process. It's not a failure. It's a chance to learn and keep moving forward. When I was doing this, when I realized I wasn't eating enough fruits and veggies at the time, I also was driving a lot. And I realized through one of my relapses or reoccurrences where I didn't have fruits and veggies for a few days, I was like, oh, I need to pack them with me. Right? And I was able to realize that because I wasn't in this shame part of me where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never good enough. I'm such a child. I can't do it right. I'm never going to eat right and be like one of those perfect wellness girlies. But instead I was like, okay, here I am falling back in this habit, okay, here's how I can eat more fruits and veggies. I can start packing them with me when I go places, right? So we want to cycle upwards. We want to use the relapse or the reoccurrences to help move us forward. So instead of beating yourself up, what can I learn from this? How can I adjust and keep going? Every setback is an opportunity to spiral upwards. And now, as I have been working on, the fruits and veggies and also working on my actual focus and work habits, I can tell you this for certain, that even when I quote unquote relapse now, or have a reoccurrence now, where maybe I'm not as focused or I'm distracted or I end up scrolling on my phone, I still am so much better at handling things in that relapse than I was when I quote unquote relapsed or had a reoccurrence years ago. Right? Years ago, I maybe would have been distracted for an hour and then panicked and then didn't create quality work and this whole thing. Now, I'm recognizing my distractions for like 10 minutes and I rein myself in and it doesn't ruin my whole day. That's huge. Spiral upwards. So overall, what we really talked about today are letting go of perfectionistic fantasies. They're not real. They don't serve you. Starting from a place of self-belief, you are already enough, and your goals should reflect that. Thinking of your goals as a spectrum and anticipating the process. Relapse isn't a failure. It's part of growth. It's part of change. Like, for example, if you see somebody that went through like a huge weight loss journey and you're seeing their TikTok or their reel of it and they're sharing it, I want you to think of all of the times where they relapsed and then kept going. That will be so helpful. Okay, so my last one, my fifth one here, is thinking about something that'll be really fun, that will really add value to your life. One of my resolutions that honestly changed my entire life was I wanted to feel more connected. Obviously, that led me on the path that I am now. It led me to me talking to this little camera and now being a girl in a box that you are watching or listening to. But that goal at the time was like, I really want to feel more connected and I really want to have meaningful friendships. It's really important to me, right? That wasn't coming from a fix myself kind of place, and it was something that I really wanted. So thinking about something that will really be really fun and add value to your life. And you'd be surprised once you let go of the perfectionistic fantasy how many things could actually be fun. I never thought budgeting like I have been and tracking my spending would be fun until I set that goal this year and was like, oh my gosh, like I get so excited about my spreadsheet now, right? And it adds so much value to my life. So these 5 things are going to be really helpful, but honestly, the first one, don't come at it from shame, come at it from enoughness. And thank you so much for listening today. I would love to hear what you think about this episode, what resonated with you. If you have any ideas, this isn't a Jewel knows absolutely everything. You have so much value and knowledge and insight to share. So please share. Let me know. And let us all know. Let us all benefit from your insight and your knowledge. And also, if you want to share any of your resolutions with me, I would love to hear them. So feel free to comment below, send me a DM. I would love to hear them. I am going to be sharing an episode soon on how to create more meaningful connection in 2025 without adding more to your plate. But if you want that as a goal, one thing that you could do to get started is to listen to episode 2 of the podcast, where I have my 2 best friends that I use friendship science on to make them my friends. And in that episode, I tell them how I use friendship science to make them my friends. And that might help give you a really great place to start if you want to create a resolution around more connection. All right. Thanks for listening, y'all, and I will see you soon. Thanks for joining me on the Socially Delightful podcast. I'm Jewel, and I'm truly so grateful that you came and hung out with me today. If this podcast meant something to you, it would mean so much to me if you left me a review so that way I could keep making content that you love. And if you really want to make my whole day, share this podcast to your Instagram story and tag me at Connection with Jewel so I can shout you out. Or Send me a message and let me know what resonated with you or what you want to hear next. And I'll see you at the next episode.